My name is Emily, and 3 years ago, I worked as a night shift waitress at a small diner on a quiet stretch of highway. It was usually a peaceful job, but the nights could get lonely, and at times, a little strange. Back then, I was 22, living alone in a modest apartment and taking the bus to work, starting at 6 p.m. and clocking out at 2 a.m. The clientele was always the same: tired truckers, partygoers on their way home, and locals stopping in for a quick bite. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills, and I hadn't faced any serious problems, at least not until that night. It was a quiet Thursday, almost boring. Most of the customers had left before midnight, and I was finishing up cleaning the counter. The only person left in the diner was a man who looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. He sat in the far corner, scrolling on his phone and staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Something about him made me uneasy. He seemed restless, shifting in his seat as if he couldn't decide whether to stay or leave. I tried to ignore him, but the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing minute. 10 minutes before closing, he abruptly got up and walked toward the counter. Before I could ask if he needed anything, the back door alarm blared, a sharp sound that shattered the silence of the night. The alarm made me jump, nearly dropping the rag I was holding. The man at the counter froze for a moment, his eyes wide, as if he already knew what was happening. My first instinct was to check the back door, but something about the way he stood there stopped me. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called my manager, but the call dropped before it even connected. I tried again, my hands shaking, but no signal. When I looked back at the counter, the man was gone. My chest tightened, and the silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the diner had been swallowed by something bigger, something ominous. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a malfunction with the alarm. Maybe the man had gone to check it out himself and would come back soon. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the kitchen area. Grabbing a knife from the counter, I shouted with a trembling voice, "Is someone there?" No response, just the footsteps, getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The diner, which had always been a safe place, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows that seemed to shift with every breath I took. The sound of those footsteps grew louder, and my mind started piecing together things I didn't want to admit. What if the man knew exactly what was happening? He'd been far too nervous earlier, and now he was nowhere to be found. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but the only other exit was the front door, and I'd have to cross the entire diner to get there. Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped. Silence. A silence so heavy, it felt like it was whispering something I couldn't understand. Cautiously, I edged toward the kitchen, still clutching the knife, trying not to make a sound. The door was slightly ajar, revealing pitch-black darkness inside. I stood there, listening. That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic breathing coming from the shadows. My stomach churned. I tried to step back, but the floor creaked beneath me. Then something moved quickly on the other side of the door, so fast I couldn't process it. "Who's there?" My voice came out louder than I expected, almost a scream. No answer. But now, I was sure, I wasn't alone. The breathing stopped, replaced by a dull thud, like something heavy falling to the floor inside the kitchen. I didn't wait to see what it was. I spun around and ran for the front door, fumbling for the keys in my apron pocket. When I reached the door, my fingers shook so badly it felt like an eternity before I could fit the key into the lock. As I struggled, I heard footsteps again, this time coming from 2 directions, the kitchen and somewhere behind me, near the counter. The door finally unlocked, and I shoved it open, bursting into the poorly lit parking lot. My first thought was to grab my phone, but I realized I'd left it on the counter. The cold night air stung my skin, but at least I was outside. Or so I thought, until I noticed movement through the diner's window. It wasn't just a shadow. It was the man from earlier, standing in the middle of the diner, staring directly at me. He didn't look surprised or scared, just watching. His eyes had a strange calmness, almost unsettling, like he was waiting for something. As I stood frozen in the parking lot, I heard the sound of tires approaching. Turning toward the road, I saw the headlights of a truck. Relief washed over me as I waved frantically. It was one of the regular truckers, a guy named Jack, who often stopped by for coffee. But before he could fully pull into the lot, the shattering sound of breaking glass erupted behind me. I turned just in time to see the man from the diner stepping out with something in his hands, a metal bar glinting under the dim light. My body moved on instinct. I ran toward Jack's truck, screaming for help. Jack, a burly man with a deep voice, jumped out of his truck, holding a flashlight, clearly confused by the chaos. "What's going on, kid?" he asked, his tone both concerned and commanding. Before I could answer, the man from the diner stopped on the sidewalk, just a few feet away from us. Under the truck's lights, he looked even less human. Sunken eyes, tense posture, and a predatory stillness. Jack stepped in front of me, shielding me, and yelled, "What do you want? Get out of here!" But the man didn't respond. He just stood there, gripping the metal bar like he was waiting for something. Jack took a few steps forward, holding his flashlight like a weapon. That's when we both realized the horrifying truth. The man wasn't alone. Emerging from the back door of the diner was a second figure, this one taller and thinner, moving almost like a shadow stretching across the ground. My stomach dropped. The silence around us was unnatural. No cars on the road, no wind, not even the sound of insects. It was as if the world had stopped. But Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wrench from his truck and yelled for me to get inside the cab and lock the doors. I obeyed, but even behind the thick glass, I felt no safer. From the truck's cab, I watched as Jack tried to confront the two figures. Something was off about the way they moved. The shadowy one seemed to glide, its footsteps soundless, while the man from the diner stayed unnervingly still, watching every move Jack made. My eyes were glued to the scene, but my thoughts were racing. Who were these people? Why were they here? And more disturbingly, why did they seem so unnatural? Jack shouted something I couldn't make out, and then the shadow darted toward him faster than I could follow. 1 second, it was by the diner's door, and the next, it was right in front of him. Jack swung the wrench, but it passed through empty air, like nothing was there. My heart raced, and I screamed from inside the cab, but it was useless. The man from the diner finally began to move, this time walking directly toward the truck. I ducked down, trying to hide behind the dashboard, my hands shaking so much I could barely press the lock button. Suddenly, the truck's horn blared, shattering the suffocating silence. The sound jolted me, and I hit my head on the roof of the cab. That's when I realized Jack had triggered the truck's alarm. "Start the engine and get out of here, now!" he yelled, his voice desperate. My trembling fingers found the keys still in the ignition, and with a shaky twist, I turned them. The engine roared to life, but before I could shift into gear, the man from the diner slammed the metal bar against the windshield. The glass cracked, but didn't break. That was all the motivation I needed. I slammed my foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires screeching on the asphalt as I sped out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jack running in the opposite direction, trying to distract them. My chest tightened. I wanted to stop, to go back for him, but I knew if I hesitated, neither of us would make it out alive. My only thought was to keep driving, to put as much distance as possible between me and that diner. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted the glowing lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled into the lot and barely managed to park before collapsing onto the ground. My legs shook so badly that I couldn't stand. The attendant rushed out to help, but I could hardly string together a coherent sentence to explain what had happened. He called the police, and I sat there, trembling, waiting for them to arrive. When the police finally showed up, I led them back to the diner, but it was eerily empty. There was no sign of Jack, the man from the diner, or the shadowy figure. The back door was still wide open. The shattered glass from the windshield littered the ground, and Jack's flashlight lay abandoned in the parking lot. The officers filed it away as an unresolved incident, but I still can't explain what happened that night. I never returned to the diner, and as for Jack, well, I never heard from him again. Sometimes I like to believe he got away, but deep down, I know I might never know the truth. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, you know? I live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people leave their bikes in the yard without worrying. My name is John, I'm 34, and my nightly routine was always simple. Taking Max, my old and lazy Labrador, out for a quick walk before bed. This started back in 2019 when I was dealing with insomnia. I used those walks to clear my head, listen to the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, sometimes even peeking into the lit-up houses, imagining the lives of the people living there. It was kind of therapeutic, you know? But that all changed that week. And to this day, I can't fully explain what happened. The first time I saw the guy was at the beginning of the week. He was tall, wearing a gray hoodie that looked worn out, with the hood pulled over his head. He jogged with light, steady steps, but what caught my attention was that he always seemed to show up on the same street as me at the same time. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. After all, lots of people go for runs at night. But as the days went by, I noticed he appeared every single night, exactly when I stepped outside. Always on the opposite sidewalk, never interacting, but also never fully ignoring me. Max didn't seem to notice him, but I started to feel this strange sensation that something wasn't right. By Wednesday night, I was genuinely uneasy. It wasn't just that he was there every night. It was how he moved. Always the same rhythm, his steps so light they barely made a sound, and he never seemed to sweat or lose his breath. This time, I noticed he slowed down as I walked, almost as if he was matching my pace, but from across the street. My heart started racing, but I tried convincing myself it was just paranoia. Max, as usual, seemed indifferent, focused on sniffing every post and bush we passed. I felt like the guy was looking at me, but every time I glanced up, he kept his eyes straight ahead, as if I wasn't even there. Still, I couldn't shake off the uneasiness. Thursday night, things escalated. When I turned the corner onto my street, he was already there, standing at the end of the block, like he was waiting for me. This time, he wasn't jogging. He was still, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, the hood casting a shadow over his face. Max let out a low growl, which was unusual since he hardly ever reacted to strangers. My gut told me to turn back, but I didn't want to look ridiculous, so I kept walking. I tried to act normal, but my palms were sweating and my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. As I got closer, he started walking, following the same route I was taking. This wasn't a coincidence. I was sure he knew exactly where I was going. Friday night, I seriously considered not going out. I hesitated, thinking maybe I should change the time or the route. But Max was used to the routine, and he started whining near the door. Reluctantly, I grabbed his leash and stepped outside, trying to ignore the feeling that I was making a mistake. The air felt colder than usual, and the streets were quieter. That heavy silence, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. And there he was again, standing at the end of the block, in the same spot as the night before. This time, he was staring directly at me. Not just a casual glance. His gaze was fixed, intense, like he was waiting for me to react. I tried to stay calm, but it was impossible. Even Max was tense, ears perked up and tail tucked down. I started walking faster, almost hoping he'd leave me alone. But as I passed him, I heard footsteps. They weren't the light ones from before. These were heavier, more deliberate, echoing down the empty street. I didn't dare look back. My whole body was on high alert, every muscle tight, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I turned a corner, trying to lose him, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was there, turning the same corner. My heart was pounding out of my chest. That guy wasn't just jogging around the neighborhood. He was following me. I turned another corner, this time quickening my pace almost without thinking. Max was jittery, pulling on the leash, but I couldn't focus on him. Every instinct told me I needed to get away. I passed houses with their lights off, the distant sound of a TV here and there, but there was no one else outside. Even so, the footsteps continued, always keeping the same distance from me. When I finally built up the courage to look again, he had stopped in the middle of the street, as if trying to send me some kind of warning. He didn't say anything, just stood there, completely still, the hood casting a shadow over half his face. I tried to make out any details, something that could explain what was going on, but all I saw was the faint glint of something in his hands. I couldn't tell what it was. Then, impulsively, I crossed the street and entered an alleyway that I knew cut to a parallel road. Max hesitated, as if he sensed this wasn't a good idea, but I tugged him along harder than I should have, and kept going. The alley was dark, lit only by a single flickering streetlight in the middle. Every step sounded louder there, echoing in a way that made me feel exposed. That's when I heard something that froze my blood. The footsteps had changed. They weren't behind me anymore. They were coming from the side, like he had found a faster way to reach me. I stopped in the middle of the alley, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but before I could react, the streetlight went out completely. In the dark, my mind spiraled into complete chaos. I couldn't see anything, only hear the sound of footsteps getting closer. It was impossible to tell which direction he was coming from, but I felt him nearby. Very close. Max started growling low, something he almost never did. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might explode, and my hands shook as I clung to the leash. Suddenly, I heard a different sound, a dry click, like something being unlocked or opened. I didn't know what it was, but it was enough to send me running. I gripped the leash tightly and bolted down the alley, stumbling over trash cans and nearly falling a few times. Max kept up, almost dragged along by my panic. When I finally reached the parallel street, I looked back, expecting to see him following me, but he wasn't there. Everything seemed quiet again, like nothing had happened. Even so, I couldn't relax. My gut told me he was still nearby. I kept walking fast, almost running, until I reached my front door. Once inside, I locked the door and shut all the windows. My entire body was shaking, and I was drenched in cold sweat. Max sat by the door, ears alert, as if he was waiting for something to happen. I grabbed my phone, thinking about calling the police. But what could I say? That a man had been following me? That he seemed strange? They probably wouldn't take me seriously. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring at the front door, half expecting him to show up. Max didn't sleep either, lying at my feet, but staying alert. When the sun finally came up, I felt a little safer, but I was still too shaken to leave the house. I called in sick to work and spent the day trying to make sense of what had happened. Who was he? And more importantly, what did he want? Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was his shadow in the alley, standing still with that strange sound echoing around me. That night, I made a decision. I took Max out for a walk, but this time I chose a completely different route, far from the usual streets. I went to a part of the neighborhood I rarely visited, hoping to avoid any chance of running into him again. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The streets were calm, and I even started to feel like maybe it had all been a big misunderstanding. But when I turned the last corner before heading home, I saw something that made me freeze. He was there, standing on the sidewalk across the street, as if he knew exactly where I'd be. Only this time, he wasn't alone. 2 other figures stood beside him, dressed similarly, all of them still, staring directly at me. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I ran back home, Max sprinting alongside me. I locked everything up again, and in that moment, I decided I wouldn't go out at night anymore. To this day, I don't know who he was or why he was following me, but I never saw him again. A few months later, I sold the house and moved to an apartment where I feel safer. But every time I walk down an empty street or see someone jogging at night, I get that same chill, like he's still out there, watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to show up again. I rented my first apartment on my own at the beginning of March last year. I had just turned 26, and after years of sharing rent with roommates, I decided it was time to have my own space. I found the perfect spot in a newly renovated building in a neighborhood that was becoming trendy but still affordable. The apartment was small but cozy, an open kitchen, a spacious living room, and a decent view from the window. The rent fit my budget, which already felt too good to be true. The lease mentioned recent renovations in the building, so the freshly painted white walls and the modern details made it seem like a lucky find. But soon, I started noticing strange things. Small details, like the absurdly thick windows and small, round marks on the walls, which I initially thought were left by the previous tenant hanging pictures. Weeks passed, and the feeling of unease only grew. One day, while rearranging the furniture, I found a hole about the size of a coin near the baseboard. I thought it was just a careless mistake during the renovation, but when I bent down to take a closer look, I could see a faint glimmer of light on the other side, like something reflecting back at me. I thought about covering it, but honestly, I was too lazy at the time. That same week, something even stranger happened. The maintenance guy entered my apartment while I was at work. I found out because he left a note taped to the door saying he had checked the plumbing. But I had never requested that, and the notice left me feeling uneasy. It felt invasive, but I didn't want to make a fuss. I tried to forget about it, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. Things took an even stranger turn a few nights later. I was lying on the couch watching TV when I heard a muffled noise coming from the ceiling, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It was late, and I knew the apartment above mine was empty because the landlord had mentioned it when I signed the lease. I tried to ignore it, but for some reason, the sound gave me a bad feeling. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from pipes or the wind. It sounded human. I sat there in silence, waiting to hear it again, but everything went quiet. I spent the rest of the night on edge, convincing myself I was imagining things. But from that night on, I started noticing those faint noises almost every single night. Then something finally pushed me to act. I was home on a Saturday, cleaning the cabinets, when I noticed one of the holes in the wall, the ones I had ignored before, was perfectly aligned with my bed. It was impossible not to think it looked intentional. I grabbed a flashlight to take a look, but it was too dark to see what was on the other side. A chill ran down my spine, but instead of being scared, I got angry. The discomfort was turning into indignation. What was going on here? And why hadn't anyone mentioned these details during the renovation? I decided to investigate the entire building, trying to figure out what was behind all this weirdness. That's how, for the first time, I ended up in the basement. The basement wasn't exactly welcoming. It smelled damp, like a place that hadn't seen sunlight in decades, despite the supposed renovations. It was divided into narrow hallways with numbered metal doors, probably for the tenants' storage units. However, one door, unmarked, caught my attention. It was locked with a new-looking padlock, different from all the others. Normally, I wouldn't have noticed something like that, but given everything that had been happening, it seemed out of place. I stood there for a few minutes, just staring at the door, trying to decide whether to ask the maintenance guy about it or simply forget everything and go back to my apartment. But my curiosity won. The following Monday, when I saw the maintenance guy, his name was Mark, leave the building in the morning, I took the opportunity. He had left the maintenance room open, so I grabbed a huge key ring that was hanging on the wall. The keys were labeled with abbreviations, but none of them seemed to match the basement door. I spent the day at work, restless and anxious, and as soon as I got home, I went straight to the basement with the keys in my pocket. My hands shook as I tested each one, but finally, one of them turned. When the door opened, the first thing I noticed was a strange metallic smell, almost like rust. But what I saw was even more disturbing. A room filled with monitors, all showing live feeds of the apartments, including mine. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The monitors were arranged in rows, with cameras showing perfect angles of every room in the apartments. The screen that froze me was the one showing my bedroom. There was my bed, exactly as I had left it before going downstairs. Even the flashlight I had used to inspect the hole in the wall was still on the nightstand. My heart raced, and my hands started sweating. I scanned the other screens and saw people cooking, showering, sleeping. It was bizarre and invasive in a way I had never imagined possible. Who had access to all this, and why? While I was trying to make sense of it, I noticed something even more unsettling. Some screens showed external angles like hallways and the parking lot, but one of them, positioned in the corner, displayed the monitoring room itself. And there, on the screen, I saw myself, standing in front of the monitors with a panicked expression. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I froze for a few seconds, but the sound snapped me back to reality. Someone was coming. I dropped the keys on the floor and carefully closed the door, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding as I ran back to my apartment, every shadow along the way making me even more nervous. I locked the door behind me and tried to calm down, but I already knew I wouldn't sleep that night. That night changed everything. I couldn't stop thinking about the monitoring room and what it meant. Who else knew about the cameras? Was it something officially set up by the building, or was it something the maintenance guy, Mark, was doing on his own? I became obsessed, trying to piece together the puzzle. Every sound in the hallway made me freeze, thinking someone was coming to confront me. I even considered calling the police. But how would I explain breaking into the room and using a key I wasn't supposed to have? Besides, the idea of getting on the radar of whoever was behind this terrified me. That's when I decided to act. I started watching Mark more closely. He was a man in his mid-50s, always wearing a gray jumpsuit with the building's logo on it. Normally, he seemed friendly, even laid back, but now I noticed something else in his eyes, a calculated coldness. I forced myself to smile at him in the hallway, pretending that nothing had changed, but deep down, I felt like he knew. One night, while watching from my bedroom window, I saw him leave the building carrying a large, bulky bag. It was the opportunity I needed. As soon as he turned the corner, I rushed back to the basement with an idea: to take photos of the monitoring room as evidence in case I needed it. My mind was racing as I went down the stairs to the basement. I had my phone in hand, ready to capture everything, but my anxiety grew with every step. When I reached the door to the monitoring room, I noticed it was still unlocked. Maybe Mark hadn't had time to lock it after my last visit. I went in quickly and started taking pictures, trying to document as much as possible: the screens, the cables, the control panel. As I was photographing, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the screens showed the inside of an apartment I knew was supposed to be empty, but it wasn't empty anymore. A man in a black hood was standing in the middle of the room, completely still, staring directly at the camera. My blood ran cold. Did he know I was there? At that moment, I heard footsteps again, quicker this time. I didn't have time to think. I ran out of the room, completely forgetting to lock the door. My only thought was to get back to my apartment and act as if none of this had happened. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, trying not to make any noise, and entered my apartment as fast as my trembling hands could unlock the door. I locked it from the inside and pushed a dresser against it, my breathing ragged. I turned off all the lights and sat on the floor, trying to hear anything that might indicate someone was coming after me. But the building was silent. Too silent. The only thing keeping me company was the faint glow of my phone's screen, where the photos of the monitoring room looked almost unreal. I stayed awake all night, clutching my phone as if it were a weapon, going over the photos to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The man in the hood kept staring back at me in the image captured by the camera in the empty apartment, as if he knew exactly what I was doing. I wondered over and over if it was some kind of trap, but who would go to such lengths? And more importantly, why? When the sun finally rose, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I called work and made up an excuse not to go in. Then I started packing what I could into a backpack. I knew I had to leave that place before something worse happened. While I was packing, someone knocked on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My heart raced. I looked through the peephole and saw Mark standing there, his expression calm as always, wearing the same gray jumpsuit. He was holding an envelope in his hand. For a few seconds I froze, unsure of what to do, until he spoke in an eerily calm voice. "You dropped something in the basement last night." My entire body tensed up. I knew I hadn't dropped anything. He was testing me, waiting for me to admit that I had been there. I took a deep breath and didn't respond. After a few minutes of silence, he left the envelope on the ground and walked away. But the fear of opening that paper was almost as strong as the fear of staying there. It took me almost an hour to work up the courage to open the envelope. My hands were shaking so much that I nearly tore the paper in the process. Inside, there was only a single photograph. It was a screenshot from the camera in my apartment, taken the night before. There I was, standing in the monitoring room, exactly as I had seen myself reflected on the screen. It was a clear warning, a message that they, whoever they were, knew what I had discovered. That confirmed everything I feared. I was being watched, and maybe for much longer than I realized. I grabbed my backpack and left the apartment without looking back. I went straight to a friend's house, who let me stay without asking questions, though my appearance surely showed something was very wrong. In the following days, I hired a lawyer and reported the case anonymously. I didn't know if the police would act, but a few weeks later, I saw a news article online saying the building had been closed for investigations. I didn't dig any deeper, because just the thought of remembering what happened made me feel sick. I never found out who was behind the cameras or how long I had been monitored. To this day, I still feel like I'm being watched, even in public places, and I make a habit of checking for holes in walls and ceilings every time I go somewhere new. I haven't rented an apartment since. Now, I prefer to pay extra to live in a house where at least I feel like I have a little more control.